Good morning. This is CBC Morning Live, and you're looking right now at the Soyuz rocket that is set to take Canadian astronaut David Saint-Jacques into space this hour. The countdown is on. You can see the counter at the bottom of your screen. The blast off some 30 minutes away, set for 6:31 a.m. Eastern Time. And right now, conditions are looking good. As you can see, the skies are clear at the Baikonur Cosmodrome in Kazakhstan. David Saint-Jacques sitting inside the spacecraft at the top of that Soyuz rocket. Now, he will be the first Canadian to lift off for the International Space Station in some 6 years. And with him will be an American astronaut, Anne McClain, and a Russian cosmonaut, Oleg Kononenko. Missions like this one leave nothing to chance. Every launch is a critical test for a space program. Now, as you may remember, today's launch follows a near disaster for the Russian space program. Back in October, the Soyuz rocket failed during launch, just 2 minutes into launch, in fact, forcing an emergency abort and rare high-altitude escape for the crew. So high stakes this morning as we say hello to you. I'm Michael Serapio, sitting in for Heather Hiscox today, and we do have special live coverage for you this morning right here on CBC News Network. And that includes the guest that you're seeing right here, Chris Hadfield. He'll be joining us today, answering your questions, not only here on CBC News Network, but also on our live streams on Twitter and on the CBC News YouTube and Facebook pages, as well as cbcnews.ca. So a very big day ahead. Our special guest, Chris Hadfield, coming up in about 10 minutes' time, again, to answer your questions. So if you have any, by all means, send it to our social media pages, and we'll ask it of Chris. Also ask it of Nicole Mottolato. She's going to help us with our coverage today. So here we are, Nicole. Good morning to you.
Good morning.
So 29 minutes now, as the counter has here, to this launch for the Soyuz rocket on board David Saint-Jacques. Let's begin with the significance of this launch. Significance, first and foremost, for Canada.
Well, yes, this is the first time since Chris Hadfield's gone up. It's been a while. As Canadians, we don't get to go on as many launches because of our contribution. It all has to do with, kind of a ratio. And it's pretty exciting because this also could be the final time a Canadian goes on a Soyuz launch, because NASA is turning to private partners like SpaceX and Boeing. And it's likely, because there's so much time between Canadians launching, that the next one, Jeremy Hansen, who's been training with David over the past 9 years, will go on one of the new ones.
Well, let's rewind that a little bit, because as you say, by 2019, NASA is hoping to turn to private contractors as it returns to manned missions. But the reason why there's been this reliance on the Roscosmos program out of Russia and the Soyuz program is because NASA, as a public agency, got out of manned missions. Talk to us about that history and how the Soyuz program has essentially stepped in for international space travel.
Well, yeah, NASA in 2011 mothballed the space shuttle program. We all knew that it was going to come to an end, but they did this without any plans to launch from, without any launch vehicles planned. So they are piggybacking, relations were pretty good with Russia. Then and they basically asked, you had to pay for a ride, and actually now I think it's between $75 million and $80 million a seat. Obviously, that's not something that's sustainable for NASA, and Canada is in the same position. So, yeah, we're relying right now on Roscosmos and their tried and true technology of the Soyuz rocket.
The Soyuz rocket, as we take a look once again to this, and as we noted off top, the astronauts are now on board, astronaut and cosmonaut, yes, to properly acknowledge the Russian member of the three people that will be on board, 2 men, 1 woman, the woman being an astronaut with NASA. And you can see some discussion here as many people are watching this quite closely. So that's the significance for Canada. I also want to talk about David Saint-Jacques, because personally, this is a huge milestone for him. Yeah,
it's funny. This man has done everything. He's an astrophysicist. He's an engineer. He worked in remote. He's a physician, and he worked in remote communities. And now he's an astronaut. And here he is going to blast off to the space station. And he said that he's very excited about it.
Mm-hmm. Here he is, as we say, although we're actually not looking at David Saint-Jacques, just to be very clear. I believe this is communications in Kazakhstan countdown itself ahead of the launch, it seems like,
Yeah.
as this is the feed that we're getting, and this is a longer view of that Soyuz rocket that will be taking the crew to the ISS. How long of a journey are we talking about here? Because the launch is about 26 minutes from now. The eventual goal here is to dock with the International Space Station. How long is this all meant to last?
So the launch itself is about 9 minutes. And then they're going to have to do several orbits, and it's a 6-hour window. So before they dock with the ISS, and sometimes they actually take longer. So this isn't too bad. So I think it works out to be about 4 orbits around Earth before they actually dock.
And what they're looking for is a window that can take them out of the atmosphere and to trajectory to the ISS.
Yeah, because the ISS is 400 kilometers above Earth. And, you know, typically when we think of launches, if you think about the space station, for example, the space shuttle, that was not, that was at a different altitude. So it's just kind of the same thing. So it's going around and then it's catching up and it'll reach up to the ISS.
Reach up to the ISS. And at 9 minutes total launch, does that account for all the rocket separations? Because this is an older technology when we talk about the Soyuz program.
It is. It's older, but it's been reliable despite what happened in October. And actually what happened in October, it did its job, really. It brought the astronauts safely home. But it's just the science to, you know, fight against gravity and get the astronauts, you know, kind of away from the Earth's gravity.
Which is a bit of a break, because I think people, and we should point out that as you and I are speaking, we're looking at images right now of David Saint-Jacques. So if people don't know what Canada's newest astronaut looks like, that is David Saint-Jacques that you see there. A very exuberant man. I've never seen a photo of him not smiling or being in a positive attitude, I have to say. But that said, for people who are used to the shuttle launches, if we think of the Soyuz, you almost need to think back to the old Apollo programs when we saw separations of rockets, as that was oftentimes broadcast on the air and people watch it all the time. And again, tried and true technology. When Soyuz goes back to what, the 60s?
66. Yeah, 66 is when the rockets were developed. And then, so Soyuz has a funny thing, because it's Soyuz rockets are called the Soyuz, and so are the capsules. Okay. So you have to actually separate between the spacecraft and the rocket. The spacecraft themselves, first successful one was 1968.
Okay. You know, I'm going to go back to David Saint-Jacques, because you noted the fact that he's been training a long time, but tell us more about him, because he was one of thousands of candidates that was chosen, along with Jeremy Hansen, who's going to be Canada's next astronaut, to actually be the next Canadians in space. Tell us more about David Saint-Jacques.
David's a wonderful, like I've met him. I've actually did the Great Canadian space race kind of thing in the form of you know, the Great Race. So, and he is so pleasant. He's obviously focused. I mean, he has done several studies. He's, like I mentioned, a physician, astrophysicist. He's got a commercials pilot license as well. He seems to be a person who, task at hand is throws himself at it and really focuses on that. And he's a very driven person and really anxious to get up there. He said he's looking forward to it.
Well, you say driven by the very fact the number of languages he speaks. So fluent in English and French, but also I think it was like Russian is amongst his. He is, obviously, because he's there. Spanish, I believe, was also amongst them. So, and one more language, although I'm forgetting that right now. But we're talking about a very accomplished man.
Yes.
And you know, as you and I are speaking here, we want to remind people that they can ask Nicole any question they want. You can do that through his social media pages. You can also ask it of Chris Hadfield, who will join us, of course, the former commander on the ISS back in 2013. So he's going to join us in a few minutes' time. But we also want to note the fact that CBC News is also on the ground in Baikonur, at the Baikonur Cosmodrome, rather, in Kazakhstan. In fact, Chris Brown is there. He joins us right now. Hello to you, Chris.
Well, it is a very cold, very crisp day here in Baikonur, Kazakhstan. They're making announcements over the loudspeaker because the launch countdown is really just moments away. Of course, the rocket in the background here, about 700 or so meters, perfect vantage point to see what's going on. It really has been a remarkable day already. We've seen David Saint-Jacques come out of his hotel room. He had signed the door of his room. He came out. He waved to a huge crowd of people who were there, got on the bus, and then went to an area where they suited him up with his spacesuit on. It was right behind plexiglass, and then he had a conversation with his family. Really, really interesting to hear all the comments. His kids were asking him about holidays, where are they going to go when they come back. one little boy, one of his sons said, "It's too bad we're going to miss ski season." Another one asked him about what he had for breakfast. The answer was an omelet and chocolate. Right now, he's up at the top, right at the top of the Soyuz rocket. It's going to take him, after liftoff, about 6 hours to get into orbit, 4 orbits around the Earth, 90 minutes apiece, and by that time, the Soyuz will have got enough velocity to hook up with the International Space Station. It's a 6.5-month mission or so. If he stays up at the ISS for that long, that would actually set a record for space endurance for Canadians. But look, that's all in the future. Right now, we're just waiting for the moment, the liftoff of Soyuz MS-11. Chris Brown, CBC News in Baikonur, Kazakhstan.
And our thanks to Chris. Yes, we are, in fact, waiting for liftoff. As I'm joined here, I'm Michael Serapio sitting in for Heather Hiscox today. Special coverage of the Soyuz launch that carries David Saint-Jacques to the International Space Station today. And I'm joined right now by Nicole Moltolado, who is a science and technology reporter with CBC News. She's going to be here throughout the morning, not only answering my questions, but your questions as well. So feel free to ask Nicole any questions you may have about the mission and the launch ahead. So interesting, Nicole, to hear Chris Brown talk about David and his children, because there is that moment, and we've seen some of the image over this weekend where he was able to interact with his family, but only through a glass partition, because they've essentially been in quarantine for days now. Tell us about that.
Yeah, I mean, this dates back to the original, the origin of the space program. You got to make sure that your astronauts are healthy. So they keep them in quarantine and keep them away from anybody who might be ill. And it's really important. You don't want to go up there and be sick, right? It does happen, but you kind of like to avoid that.
Space Tylenol.
Yeah,
in case it happens.
Exactly. Well, he's a doctor, so.
And they're all college scientists, so at least they are well at hand as we count down to the launch some 19 minutes from now. And as I said, we are asking our viewers to ask any questions. So David Olive on Facebook says, oh boy, still using these old technology rockets. Again, Soyuz rockets go back to the 60s. How safe are they? And I think that's a very relevant question, Nicole, because we noted it right off top. In October, there was a Soyuz launch that was aborted 2 minutes into launch, and that was because of a failed rocket separation, a booster rocket separation. Yep. So talk to us about the safety of the Soyuz rockets.
Well, they've had a really good run. To be fair, you go back, it's from 1966. Lately, they have been having a few more problems. For example, there was a Progress launch, so this was a supply ship that didn't fire off. I believe it was a third stage, and that was lost and had to be, the payload had to be burned up in the atmosphere. Actually, in way back when, as I mentioned, that the capsule itself was first successfully tested in 1968. Well, the reason that it was 1968 and not earlier was because one did explode, and they had to do another emergency landing. But in that time, if you look back to 1966 to now, they've had a few accidents, but they're doing well. And even the October 11th abort, these systems, if you see that video, as soon as that third, so what happened in that case was the 4 boosters in stage 1, one hit, it looks like one hit the first stage of the rocket. And as soon as that happened, they were jettisoned away safely and arrived safely on Earth. But that's not to say the U.S. hasn't had their accidents either. I mean, we know Challenger, we know Columbia with the shuttle. I mean, it does happen. Space is a dangerous business. But you know what? Like I said, for Canada at the very least, this may be our last Soyuz. And now we're going to have to worry about new technology, and how is that going to work? Are we going to have any accidents there as well? As
you say, there's always an underlying risk, although we need to point out that David Saint-Jacques was asked about that, and he is expressing absolute confidence as he goes up, absolute excitement for his chance to go to space and be on the ISS. That said, Nicole, I'm going to ask you to keep sitting with me, but joining us right now, one of the very few people on this Earth who actually knows what these 3 astronauts are going through. We're talking about Chris Hadfield. He has, of course, made that journey from the launch pad in Kazakhstan aboard a Soyuz rocket himself to the ISS, International Space Station. And in 2013, Chris Hadfield became the first Canadian to command a spaceship as commander of the ISS. And we talk about accomplished people. Well, He's author, he's a professor, he's a test pilot, and also an astronaut. Chris Hadfield, he joins us this morning from Los Angeles. Chris, do you ever get tired of that huge resume as we introduce you on air?
Yeah, I appreciate you saying it, Michael. Good morning to you. How are you?
Good morning. You know, a lot of excitement today. And you know what it's like to actually be sitting in a Soyuz waiting for a launch. I want to begin there because David Saint-Jacques is now some 16 minutes away from the start of his journey to the International Space Station. What's it like in these final minutes waiting for the launch to actually take place?
You know, what's happening right now is they're wearing heart monitors, and they're inside a pressure suit, but the monitor on their heart goes through this skinny little wire and goes out to a little antenna on the Soyuz, and it's being sent to Moscow, where there's a doctor sitting watching his heartbeat, and the other two astronauts' heartbeats as well. And so they're actually laying there nice and calm and relaxing. It's still 15 or 16 minutes till launch. They've been playing them some music to keep them calm. So it's actually a time where you really gather yourself. I think it's a nice tradition. Things are about to get really busy for 6 months, and the next 10 minutes of launch are overwhelmingly busy. So it's actually a brief moment of calm before the storm right now, and you use it to relax and get yourself ready.
I could imagine that would be challenging, trying to relax. What was going through your head in the last 10, 15 minutes?
Some of my favorite music, but what David has in his hands is the emergency checklist. There's one page that he's looking at that lists everything that's supposed to happen during launch and the exact down to the second when it's supposed to happen, and then all of the potential waterfall emergencies that could happen if things fail at different times on the way up. And so he's wearing his full pressure suit. He's got his thick, heavy gloves on. He's holding onto that checklist. And what he's doing right now is moving across it with his finger, looking, reminding himself of all the key moments and the actions he has to take on the emergency panel in front of himself, just in case something goes wrong. It's just a last moment to slowly let everything else in the world focus down to just the panel of the Soyuz and the events coming up, to let everything else disappear out of his concentration, to allow himself to focus on really just the matter at hand.
And Chris, as you know, we are inviting Canadians across the country to ask you, and also Nicole here in studio, any questions they would like about this mission, this launch, about David. And we actually do have a question right now. This is from Phil Grouchy, who's sending us a question for you, Chris, via Facebook. He writes, is this mission training any different than when you were sent to space?
It's very similar. David has been training for this as an astronaut for the last 9 years, specifically for this flight, really for the last 3 years, 2.5, 3 years. And it was very similar for me. The vehicle has some small improvements since when I flew it 6 years ago this month. But fundamentally, it's the same, and the emergencies are the same, and the responses are the same. So his preparation has been very similar. You know, he had to learn to speak Russian and then learn to study all of orbital mechanics and control theory in Russian, and now fly the vehicle during good times and during emergencies in a language he wasn't speaking as a child. So all that has been going on to get him here. The preparation is quite similar. He's been living in Russia for on and off for years, and he spent the last 2 weeks in quarantine. It's all very familiar and very parallel to the experience that I went through. But it's really exquisite preparation process. Things are unforgiving, and they happen incredibly fast. And the only way to be ready for all that is to go through that long apprenticeship that he's gone through in order to get ready for today.
Okay, another question here. This is from Isabel, who is asking via our email address. Hi, Chris. How come the astronauts from October's launch are not going today? And, you know, I have to be fair, a lot of people are asking that because this mission was not supposed to, or at least David was not supposed to go up until the 20th of December, to my understanding. Instead, he's going up today. And there is a question, what about the aborted mission? Why not those astronauts?
Part of it, if you can just think, I don't know, of a bus terminal where there are buses coming and buses going, and you've got a big plan, and you've got everybody counting on what's on, or maybe delivery trucks, what's on all of those trucks and how everything's all set. And then for whatever reason, one of the trucks breaks down. The other trucks and the other buses were already ready, and they had specific crews and specific skills and things that were being carried in them. And it's not that easy just to shift everything as a result of one failure. And they also, there were only 2 astronauts, or 1 astronaut, 1 cosmonaut on the October 11th flight. And they need all 6 people up on space station, if possible, to do all of the science. If there's only 5, then you can't get as many things done. So depending on your rotation model of who's going up and who's coming down, that's a big factor at play. And then there's the specific skill set. Who has trained for which experiments? Not everybody's qualified to do everything. And those folks will have a chance to fly again. Alexei and Nick, who didn't get all the way to space on October 11th, they'll be looking ahead maybe 2 or 3 flights from now to change the big rotation. But it's a many year training process, and you don't want to disrupt everything just because one vehicle had an abort.
Mm-hmm. Jacques, when we talk about David Saint-Jacques, he is part of a very limited group of Canadians who've had the honor of going up to space. And it's interesting that you mentioned the last crew, Chris, because there seems to be a real familiarity amongst astronauts, cosmonauts, regardless of what nationality you are. There seems to be this shared experience of training as well as passion, if you will.
Well, it has to be that way. Prior to David being ready for the launch here in just a few minutes, he trained as the backup for the previous launch. If they had, on the day before, slipped on the ice and twisted their knee, David would have launched on that vehicle on October 11th, and the same for the launch before that. So you train as the backup to be ready for a couple crews. So that means you're with them day in, day out for months and years prior to your own flight. And there's a crew, of course, that was the backup for David and his crew today. Same sort of thing. And you've been interfacing with these astronauts from all of the different countries of the space station for the last decade. And so it's a very small cast of a play where anybody can be, called into the lead role at any time. And so, yeah, there's a big interplay of everyone, and you're all trying to get ready for a morning like this one, when you're called sort of to the ultimate test and make sure you're capable of doing all the things that you might have to do.
Well, there certainly is excitement from Russia to the United States to right here in Canada as we watch this launch of the Soyuz. Chris, I'm going to ask you to stay where you are because we have so many more questions to ask of you. Chris Hadfield joining us from Los Angeles. Remember, you can ask Chris any of your questions using any of our social media streams or emailing us here at cbc.ca. We're going to keep putting those addresses up for you. But right now, we want to focus our attention to right here at home because our Jayla Bernstein is at a watch party right now with the Canadian Space Agency, at the Canadian Space Agency, in fact, and she takes us through what people are anticipating as we count down to the launch of the Soyuz.
We're here at the Canadian Space Agency headquarters in Saint-Hubert. We're just outside of Montreal, and we're actually about 15 minutes away from where David Saint-Jacques himself grew up. I'm going to give you a little bit of a tour of the room here. You can see people are filing in. There's a little bit of buzz, a lot of anticipation in the air this morning, because this, for people who work at the Canadian Space Agency, it's really like Christmas Day. It's so exciting for staff here to finally see, or to see, one of their astronauts launch off into space. So an exciting day. People really had to wake up in the middle of the night to be here this morning, but for them, it's worth it. We're also going to be hearing from some dignitaries this morning. We're seeing a lot of guests here as well, not just staff members. I'm going to take you down the aisle near the stage where we'll be hearing from Navdeep Bains, who of course is the Minister of Science, Innovation and Economic Development. We're going to just turn the corner here, and I'm going to show you a model of the rocket, of the spacecraft, the Soyuz spacecraft that David Saint-Jacques will be traveling in. So this is where he is actually right now, early this morning in Kazakhstan. He's probably having a little bit of downtime right about now inside the spacecraft. We know that once the pre-flight measures are taken care of, they have about 40 minutes the astronauts do to listen to some music, to listen to some playlists. And we know that on his playlist, there's a bit of David Bowie as well as some Radiohead. So he's enjoying some rare downtime before he gets to his final destination. destination, which is, of course, the International Space Station. This is a model of where David Saint-Jacques is going to be spending about 6.5 months, and he's going to be busy. He's going to be looking at the effects of weightlessness on humans. He's also going to be looking at practicing and looking into advances into remote medicine or telemedicine. So even though this is the longest a Canadian astronaut has been on the International Space Station, he's going to be very busy the whole time. Jayla Bernstein, CBC News, Saint-Hubert, Quebec.
And we will check in with Jayla throughout the morning as she is at the Canadian Space Agency. Again, I'm Michael Serapio sitting in for Heather Hiscox today, a very special edition of Morning Live as we count down to the launch of the Soyuz rocket. On it will be Canadian astronaut David Saint-Jacques. Joining us once again right now is another Canadian astronaut, Chris Hadfield, well known amongst Canadians, as well as Nicole Martorado, who is here in studio with me, a science and technology writer for CBC News. You know, Chris, I have to say, we heard from Jayla Bernstein. They're listening to music, David Bowie, Radiohead. What do you think of the playlist? You as a music aficionado yourself.
Yeah, it's kind of nice. The chief trainer in Russia that has been getting the three of them ready to fly the Soyuz, they've been spending a lot of time with him. Mine was named Yuri. His dad was also an instructor at Star City. So they really take it seriously, very professional, but they're also really kind and thoughtful about it. And it was actually Yuri who had talked to the crew and said, hey, and talked to our families, what music you think would be nice for them to listen to as they're just, gathering themselves and thinking about. And they just described it as downtime. It's really not downtime. It is preparation time. It's a chance to really stop thinking about anything else, their family that's just sitting a kilometer or so away, all of the other distractions in life. The music and the tradition of it really helps the crew get intensely focused on what truly matters. So music can have that effect. And I'm not sure Radiohead would do that for me, but I'm glad it works for David.
Whatever works for him, absolutely. I'm going to ask you now, Nicole, because, we're talking to Chris. Obviously, he's been up. You've been watching these launches for years now. You've covered these launches for years now. I'm going to ask you to take off your journalist hat and put on your science geek hat.
Oh, that's easy.
How exciting is it for you to be watching this happen?
I'm super excited. It's a Canadian, first of all, and I've been following David and Jeremy for years since they've been...
Jeremy Hansen being the next Canadian who'll go up to space. So
I'm really excited. All these launches, I've always hold your breath kind of thing, and oh my gosh, they're going into space and they're going into to do science and to do research that is applicable here on Earth that many people don't realize. So it's amazing.
Amazing, absolutely. Chris, one more question here very quickly because we've got 3 minutes before launch. But Adam Moore is asking, what do you do if you have to go to the bathroom while en route to the ISS?
Well, the best thing to do is just hold it, Adam. But if you can't, nobody asked that question for the very first astronauts to fly, and it got kind of messy. So they realized we got to do something about it. And so, in fact, everybody just wears a diaper underneath their suit, just in case. I am proud to. I don't know if I'm proud, but I didn't use my diaper. But you're on your back for hours and hours, and the launch, the rendezvous and docking could be delayed if they ran into a deployment problem or some sort of navigation problem or whatever. So it could be a long time. So on the 2 flights I did on the space shuttle and on my 3rd flight when I was in David's seat on the Soyuz, underneath that big official-looking astronaut pressure suit, David's wearing a diaper.
Well, was it the Cub Scouts? Their motto, be prepared.
Yes.
So.
Yeah.
And better that than not, I can imagine. Anyways, we are now some 2 minutes away from launch. And very quickly, Chris, in a minute or so, what are you watching out for as the Soyuz launches from its pad?
It's a beautifully proven system. It's flown approaching 2,000 times with the unmanned and the manned version of the Soyuz rocket and the Soyuz spaceship. But of course, it is the most dangerous 10 minutes of his entire 6 months in space because all of that propulsive, explosive power happens. So what I'm really watching is the quality of the color of the flame originally, making sure that that the mixture of the fuel and the oxygen is burning properly. That critical initial moment where you have more push than weight and the vehicle starts to lift itself off the pad, and then each of the little steps and sort of windows that they go through on the way up. Here, 2.5 minutes away, I'm going to be watching the color of the flame, the symmetry of how it's accelerating away, and then the various separations and important steps on their way to space.
Okay, very quickly, can you describe the color you're looking out for here?
Yeah, it starts fairly rough. Of course, it's picking up a lot of the dirt and the cement and the water underneath them. It'll be sort of a rich orange originally, and then it'll be becoming sort of more and more yellow, and then becoming almost a clear flame as they get higher and higher. And then we're all watching for what went wrong 2 minutes into the launch last time, as the 4 strap-on boosters that get them above the air, they separate around 2 minutes into the launch, and a clean separation is it's a huge relief for the crew when it happens. Because getting rid of those boosters means you're over one of the big hurdles that gets you to space.
Thank you, Chris. And with that, we want to bring people to Kazakhstan right now. Let us listen in these final moments before the Soyuz takes off on board. David Saint-Jacques, Canadian astronaut, along with him, crew member, NASA astronaut, as well as a Russian cosmonaut, as they make their way to the International Space Station. You're watching special coverage right here on CBC News Network, as well as CBC News' social media streams on Morning Live. Stay with us. We are now going to keep watching in silence as we take in the image and the sounds of the Soyuz launch.
You can see the first umbilical tower retracted.
Auto sequence initiated.
Auto sequence is initiated. That second tower now retracting 10 seconds from launch.
Second umbilical tower separates.
Engines have started and are now at the preliminary thrust level, throttling up.
Engines at maximum thrust, liftoff.
And liftoff. We have liftoff of Anne McLean, David Saint-Jacques, and Oleg Kononenko blasting through the Kazakh sky to the International Space Station.
Copy.
Everything looking good so far. Good first stage performance. Soyuz delivering 930,000 pounds of thrust.
Copy. Everything is fine on board. 30 seconds into flight. All parameters are nominal.
30 seconds in, everything's still looking good. First stage will burn for 2 minutes. First 2 minutes and 6 seconds of the flight.
Vehicle stabilization is steady. Copy. 50 seconds. Chamber pressure is nominal. 60 seconds.
Everything looking good. Vehicle is stable. Good first stage performance. The vehicle now traveling over 1,100 miles per hour.
30 seconds into flight. Everything is nominal. 80 seconds. All parameters are nominal. Copy. Everything is
1 minute 30 seconds into the flight. Everything's still looking good. The stage again will burn for until 1 minute 58 seconds into the flight, and you'll see those 4 strap-on boosters jettison.
100 seconds. Copy. $110 seconds.
Escape tower has been jettisoned, and those 4 strap-on boosters also jettisoned. They've completed their job and will drop away at an altitude of 28 miles.
Confirm.
100. Now transitioning to an animation, you can see from the launch pad losing sight of the Soyuz, but getting good second stage performance.
We're feeling fine, and everything is excellent on board. Copy, and vehicle is stable. 150 seconds into flight.
Second stage, this core stage, still performing well. The launch shroud has been jettisoned, revealing the Soyuz underneath.
Launch shroud jettison confirmed.
This second stage will continue to burn until 4 minutes 43 seconds into the flight.
170 seconds into flight. All systems are operating nominally. Copied.
Everything looking good. This second stage providing somewhere between 178,000 and 222,000 pounds of thrust.
.200 seconds into flight. Second stage. Thrusters are operating nominally. Copy.
Everything's still looking good. 1 minute left of this second stage. Right in the middle of the animation, you'll see a lattice structure. That will be where the third stage will start to burn, begin a hot staging technique, start burning before the end of the second stage, and actually push that second stage away.
Seconds into flight. Pitch your roll. Parameters are all nominal. Copy.
Everything's still looking good. About 10 more seconds of this second stage burning.
280 seconds into flight. Second stage separation confirmed.
And we have confirmation of a good second stage separation. The third stage is lit. Will burn for about 4 minutes and 2 seconds, providing 67,000 pounds of thrust.
200 seconds. 300 seconds. Copy, and we're doing well. 310 seconds into flight. Vehicle is steady.
Five minutes, 30 seconds into the flight. We're in the third stage now. Everything's still looking good.
Seconds into flight. Third stage thrusters are operating nominally.
The third stage will continue to burn until about 8 minutes, 45 seconds into the flight.
Normally. 350 seconds into flight. Everything is nominal. Everything is excellent on board the Soyuz. The crew is doing well.
Good reports from the crew on board. They're feeling well as the third stage continues to burn, now 6 minutes and 15 seconds into the flight.
Устойчиво. 400 seconds into flight. Because stabilization is steady. Copy.
Seven minutes into the flight, everything's still looking good.
You are watching special coverage of a Soyuz launch from Kazakhstan. On board David Saint-Jacques. You are watching CBC Morning live here on CBC News Network. I'm Michael Serapio sitting in for Heather Hiscox, and joining us once again is CBC science and technology writer Nicole Mortulato, and from Los Angeles, Canadian astronaut as well as author, professor Chris Hadfield. We've been watching this all unfold, listening to the description. And I have to say, my heart was in my chest pounding. I feel very excited for them. Chris, what's it like for you to be watching all this unfold?
The more you know, the more you kind of recognize what can go wrong and how non-guaranteed it is. And so, and how helpless I am just watching. I would much rather be on board where at least I could do something. But I'm delighted to see that, just how well it's going. The engines are getting close to shutting down. Everything seems to have worked perfectly so far. Been listening to the Russian engineer back in Moscow, up just north of the city in Korolev, who's been talking, telling everybody how it's going. Everything's just been right down the middle of the pike, which is great. Looks like the vehicle's really behaved itself today. We still have engine shutdown on time, and then all the deployments of the solar arrays and things to go. So there's still a big critical step coming, but so far, perfect.
So still a big critical step. How far away are we from that step, would you say?
I have to listen to them to hear. I have a little bit of time lag on the screen that I'm watching. I think we're just within a few seconds of that, like 20 seconds of that now.
Okay, tell you what, why don't we go back full frame on what we're getting from the feed, and then we're going to pick up our conversation once that final, and I believe there it goes.
Third stage separation. Single liquid-fueled engine has shut down and dropped away at an altitude of 126 statute miles.
Congratulations with the...
Everything's still looking good. The third stage is performing an avoidance maneuver by opening a valve in his liquid oxygen tank.
Thank you very much for your support. Antares, this is Moscow.
And we have confirmation of the spacecraft separation. Soyuz capsule and crew safely in orbit. The spacecraft is automatically executing its pre-program commands to deploy the antennas and solar arrays.
Stage separation, and you are go to close RPV-1 and RPV-2 airflow regulators.
And Chris, I think we have it, the final confirmation that they're in orbit, things are going well. And we have to point out once again to those that aren't aware of it who are watching us right now, part of the reason why we've been on pins and needles over this launch, and underlying the fact that there's a risk with any space travel, as Nicole Mortulato was telling us earlier today. There was an aborted launch back in October with Soyuz, and so that is what people were watching out for, making sure it got past the 2-minute mark when it was aborted last time around. How much pressure, how much does that add to the nerves people are feeling today? And happily, they can do away those nerves, but leading up to that point, how was that playing in, would you think, Chris?
Yeah, you call it an aborted launch, but what really happened was the rocket exploded. So it sounds sort of like a nice, an aborted launch, but yeah, the rocket exploded behind them, and they had a bunch of violent accelerations, and then their Soyuz was punched off the front, and then they came tumbling down, and a parachute slammed into the steppe of Kazakhstan near Zhezkazgan. It was a very violent but safe reaction to a horrific problem. And that's always very much uppermost in an astronaut's mind or cosmonaut's mind during launch. If it fails at this stage, what's going to happen? And just for the last 2 minutes there, when they're way up high, but they're still not going fast enough, that's the worst time to lose an engine, because then it's as if you've thrown a rock way up in the air. If it doesn't get to accelerate out to speed, it's just going to fall straight back down and give you an enormous force on your body. So right up until the last second, until the engine shuts off, the crew is super focused on whether they need to go through the abort procedures, whether they need to take over manually on making some of the automatic actions happen. So it's a huge relief to everybody that when I heard the RPV-1, RPV-1, RPV-2, they're closing the atmosphere pressurization valves, sealing off their vehicle so that now they can, with a stopwatch, measure the pressure inside their little ship and make sure there are no leaks anywhere, because that's the most important thing to check now. If the vehicle has a leak, then they need to turn around backwards, fire the engines, and come back to Earth. So they're now going through the pressure checks, but it's nice that they got to that stage.
Are you feeling a sense of relief?
Oh, yeah, huge. They're away. David is now in space. Congratulations, David Saint-Jacques. He is now an astronaut. He's been above 100 kilometers. He's orbiting the world. Huge congratulations to a good friend and to Canada's next person in space.
Well, I'm going to bring in Nicole Mortolato now because as we were watching that, Chris, I'll have you stand by because we're going to come back to you. As it was going up, I was watching you. And you had nerves on your face, and when the booster rocket separated, you were clapping silently as to not put it on air. Describe that moment as someone that has covered these stories and is obviously vested as a Canadian with David Saint-Jacques, as well as what we're seeing in Kazakhstan today.
Well, for me, especially with the jettison of the rockets, it was, okay, we're past the what happened in October part, and obviously there's other things that can happen, but that was a pretty critical point, especially what happened in October. But I mean, it's a thrilling thing to watch, to know that these people are going through enormous pressures on their body, and one stage is gone, now the next stage is gone, and it's almost like a little checklist that, okay, they're there. So it's pretty phenomenal to watch, and I'm really excited for David.
Absolutely. And Chris, as I said, we've been asking Canadians to send us questions that they can ask either of Nicole or of you. And this one is to you, Chris. This is from Martin Davies, who's from Comox, BC, and asking, Chris, can you describe some of the stresses, G-force, etc., on the crew immediately after launch?
Yeah, it's pretty heavy. The vehicle is brute forcing its way up through the atmosphere, just taking the weight on its shoulders, pushing harder and harder, pushing through the speed of sound, which builds a big wall of pressure in front of it, and then you've got to have enough force to jam through that, and it causes a lot of vibration, but mostly just a relentless, heavy pressure on your body. One thing I noticed on the Soyuz when I was flying it 6 years ago, you could actually also feel the vehicle steering, almost like a boat skimming across the water when you turn the wheel a little bit, and you can feel the vehicle trying to steer as it goes through the wind shear and the jet stream on the way up. You can feel the aliveness of the ship underneath you as it's directing you through the air. When you get above the air, when the first stage boosters explode off, it gets a little bit smoother. And the acceleration drops off. It's sort of like you're getting crushed, then you float forward, and then you're getting squished again until it gets heavier and heavier. It's as if you have 4 of yourself lying on top of you. Imagine, lying down on the floor and having people wearing their full snowmobile suits, 4 of them lying on top of you for 8 or 9 minutes while you're operating the most complicated machine you've ever flown. It's a pretty physically demanding place that David was, but it's great that the vehicle, everything, all the automatic systems work perfectly. That's a huge relief to David. And the present at the end of it is weightlessness. He's now weightless for the next 6 months.
Wonderful. Nicole, I know you have a question for Chris, too.
Yeah, I was asking, Chris, maybe you can explain what's the difference between, on your body physically, launching between the shuttle and the Roscosmos with the Soyuz?
The shuttle was a lot more fragile vehicle than the Soyuz. It was more capable. I mean, it could carry 7 people and a huge amount of equipment in the back, but it was also much less rugged, much less robust. And so we had to keep the G-loads down. And the shuttle would pull less on the way up and way less on the way home. It come home almost like a feather in comparison to the Soyuz. The Soyuz maybe isn't as magnificently elegant as the shuttle was, but it's a lot simpler and tougher and more reliable vehicle. So there's a trade-off between the two. The shuttle also, because it was the big boosters and then the shuttle in the middle all bolted together, it had a lot more internal vibration, just like a big bolted together machine. So you got shaken a lot more in the shuttle. You couldn't really even focus just because of the vibration. You had to grab onto a handhold and pull your head forward to let your neck soak up all the vibrations so you could even focus on the instruments. The Soyuz, because it's a lot smaller and skinnier, doesn't have all of that vibration. But I'd happily ride either one of them again. They're amazing ride to go on.
You know, I wonder, Chris, as we keep watching the launch and waiting for them to dock with the ISS later today, at what point do you actually get to sit back and appreciate what you're going through? Because as you say, they're very busy right now. They have a lot on their minds. Their body is going through a lot of stress. At what point do you take it in and appreciate the moment?
As soon as they've gotten all of their pressurization checks done and they know for sure that the vehicle doesn't have a leak, they'll pop their helmets open so they get a nice breath of fresh air inside the cockpit. They can maybe take their gloves off, which is a real delight, so your hands aren't sweaty. And one of the things that I really liked was seeing my wristwatch float on my wrist. Suddenly, because you're strapped into a chair and you're inside a cockpit, so there's not a lot of reminder that you're weightless yet. But to look down and see my wristwatch like magic now floating like a little snake around my wrist, it was like a little secret delight in amongst what was happening. And I was focusing on the task at hand, but it was also a reminder that I wasn't in Kazakhstan anymore.
That's amazing. So, Chris, I'm going to ask you to stay where you are. Nicole, I'm going to ask you to stay as well, because right now we want to go to the Canadian Space Agency. This is in Saint-Hubert, Quebec, and this is where former astronaut Bob Thirsk, as well as astronaut Jennifer Sidey-Gibbons and Navdeep Bains, Minister of Innovation, Science and Economic Development, are now answering questions about the launch that we just saw in Kazakhstan. Let us listen in.
Very fortunate to be here with Jenny and Bob to talk about the space program. We as a government are very committed to space. We're working on a space strategy. I had a very positive and productive meeting with the NASA administrator as well. So we see the long-term potential of space as well. And as I've said, we punch well above our weight and will continue to do so for years to come.
En français, anything in French, please?
Oui, absolument. L'espace représente beaucoup d'opportunités.
Represents a lot of opportunities for all Canadians, and particularly for our children. Today, David Saint-Jacques he's going to be having an incredible experience, as it is for me, and I'm very confident that we will be able to continue to help and support the space program.
For me, again, like I said, as a father of two young girls, it really is inspirational what David represents. And aujourd'hui, c'est un jour très spatial.
And today is an incredible day in space, and I think
from their perspective as astronauts, and also I think it's just, again, a point of pride for Canadians. We have such a proud history in space, and this is really a special moment for us to celebrate that history. We're celebrating the 20th anniversary of the International Space Station, and so again, this is so important for our children, but also the benefits to society. There's going to be 9 experiments, especially around aging, around health. That's very important, as mentioned by Jenny, in terms of the heart and blood and bones, all areas that are very important, but also the robotics, the Canadarm2. We see direct benefits here in society of how robotics has changed our lives for the better. So space has not only enormous potential, but we've seen real-life application of how space has made our lives better. So I mean, Jenny and Bob, you can speak to your own experiences as well.
Since he was a kid, David Saint-Jacques dreamed of going into space, and it was an incredible dream. Now he's realized that dream. David is in space and is beginning that journey on behalf of the rest of Canada. He's an inspiration to young Canadians. He trained in sciences, and he was supported by Canada to do difficult things.
I'll echo that by saying and stressing the importance of having these role models live their dreams and fly in space like David did today. That was particularly important for me when I was growing up, and I certainly wouldn't be where I am today if it wasn't for Canada's early space program and kind of the heroes that pushed that forward. So I'd say today is particularly special, not only from what we'll gain from David's work when he's in space, but also just what we saw this morning. It's incredible.
Having been in space on these 6 months missions before, can you talk about what the toughest part of the next 6 months is going to be for David? And feel free to answer in French for my colleagues in French.
The schedule aboard a space station is very busy. Every 5-minute increment of our life is going to be scheduled, and that'll be the same for David also. The challenge for him will be to pace himself to accomplish the work that's expected of him on behalf of the international partnership, but also to maintain enough reserve, some physical and psychological reserve. For me, the most difficult aspect of space flight was missing my family and missing my planet, Earth, nature. So he hopefully will be able to make use of some of the technologies aboard the space station to continue to function as a father, continue to function as a spouse, so that it doesn't become a distraction for the important work that he'll be doing. For
me, the most difficult thing was that I missed my family. It was difficult to go into space and be carrying out my activities as part of the international program and to continue to be a father and a spouse.
What's it like? I mean, we know that Bob Thurston's been through this before, but for you, what's it like watching this, knowing that at some point that's going to be you in that spacecraft?
It's just incredibly exciting. I mean, it's difficult to think that far down the road and put myself in those shoes when it eventually does happen. But mainly what's been on my mind today is just David is a friend, and I know that he wants this so badly. And same with Jeremy, it really is their dream. And to see David do that today, it was really special. It caught me off guard how watching him take off. I know what that means to him and to his family and how much work went into that. So as far as projecting forward to see myself in that role, I think it would just be incredible to continue my training and see where I end up. But for David, today was just monumentous. So it's a very special day.
Bob, could you just talk a little bit about David? I mean, it obviously takes a special person to, not everyone can go into space. I mean, just would you be able to talk about sort of how you know David and what kind of person he is?
Well, David is like me. He's a medical doctor, so he has an understanding of the kind of work he's going to be involved in, as Jenny described a few minutes ago as well. The other thing, as the minister mentioned, there's a lot of spin-offs from the space investments in the space program to terrestrial society, and probably the best example are the medical spin-offs as well. David, for many years, worked up in northern Canada in a remote clinical situation. The way that you care for Canadians living in rural and remote areas, the technologies, the protocols, the approaches is very similar to what you require to take care of astronauts aboard a space station or on a deep space outpost as well. So David gets that. So he'll be able to give a showcase for how investment in space technology is paying off for Canada. He's also a wonderful human being too. He's reflective, as I already said. And it's important for him to look out the window of the space station whenever he can grab a few minutes. Think about that everyone on this planet is one. We're all connected. We're not individual nations. The best thing about the International Space Station program is brought former adversarial nations together into one program to extend Canadian capability, world capabilities in space, to pursue impossible dreams, to pursue the peaceful exploration of the cosmos. And so David gets that, and he'll be bringing his international crewmates together to promulgate that message so that we can take the next step in deep space exploration.
And And we have been listening to officials at the Canadian Space Agency. As you can see, they are wrapping up their news conference, essentially sharing their thoughts on the successful launch of Soyuz MS-11 from Kazakhstan. We saw that just some 29 minutes ago on board Canadian astronaut David Saint-Jacques, now on his way to the International Space Station and essentially beginning a 6.5-month mission. Now, you were listening there to astronauts Robert Thirsk as well as Jenny Sidey-Gibbons, who herself, she will be heading off to space as well, one of the astronauts that Canada has chosen. And Navdeep Bains as well taking part in that news conference, Minister of Innovation, Science and Economic Development. It is hard to overstate just how important today's launch was, not only for the Soyuz program, but also for the Canadian Space Agency, certainly for David Saint-Jacques, who is now just the 9th astronaut, also now officially an astronaut as he has left the Earth's orbit, as we heard from Chris Hadfield. And I need to point out once again that both Chris Hadfield, Canadian astronaut, as well as Nicole Motilato, a science and technology writer with us here at CBC News, have been answering your questions throughout the day. And we encourage you to keep sending us your questions through our social media feed. We are going to ask your questions of both Chris and Nicole throughout the day as we carry special coverage of the Soyuz launch, carrying on board David Saint-Jacques. We have much more coverage as well as your questions coming up right here on CBC News Network. Do stay with us. I'm Michael Serapio, and you're watching special coverage right here on Morning Live on CBC News Network and on CBC News' social media feeds. Stay with us.
Engines have started and are now at the preliminary thrust level, throttling up.
Engines at maximum thrust, liftoff.
And liftoff. We have liftoff of Anne McLean, David Saint-Jacques, and Oleg Kononenko blasting through the Kazakh sky to the International Space Station.
Copy.
And this is CBC Morning Live, and that is the Soyuz rocket carrying Canadian astronaut David Saint-Jacques to the International Space Station. Saint-Jacques is now about 30 minutes into his flight to the ISS, and he's on the top right there of your screen, and with him are American astronaut Anne McLean and Russian cosmonaut Oleg Kononenko. And if you can make it out, a stuffed raccoon is also there. Their rendezvous with the space station set to happen later this afternoon. David Saint-Jacques, the first Canadian on a space mission in 6 years. Good morning. I'm Michael Serapio. Heather is away today. We do have special coverage for you throughout the morning right here on CBC News Network. Also live streaming our broadcast today on Twitter and on the CBC News YouTube and Facebook pages and on cbcnews.ca. And we have assembled here for you today on this special day our own space panel, if you will, of experts. Nicole Motilato, a science and technology reporter for CBC News, and also joining us one of the very few people on this earth who knows exactly what these 3 astronauts are going through. Chris Hadfield, the first Canadian to command a spaceship as commander of the ISS. He's also an author, professor, a test pilot, and he joins us today in Los Angeles. Chris, Nicole, thank you for joining us once again today. Let's begin with first thoughts because we witnessed here live on air as well as on our pages the launch of the Soyuz, and on it, David Saint-Jacques. Chris, I'll begin with you. How significant a day is today?
For David, it's something he's been intensely ready for months and getting ready for years. But now, actually, I've spent a lot more launches with the families than I have as the astronaut in the cockpit, standing there with the spouses, with the children, with the moms and the dads. And it is such a delightful day for them. So much of their lives are wrapped up in today. Not only in the safe launch of David to orbit, but also in what this means for the rest of their life. Their member of their family has now taken an enormous risk to do something that is really new for the human species. And so they have all of those emotions inside them, the nervousness, the relief, but also now the steady building wave of pride, of reality. It's no longer just a dangerous thing or a scary thing in the future, but it's now a thing that has happened in their lives, and their loved one is now on their way to go dock with the space station. It's something that can never be taken away. Mm-hmm. And there's a lovely feeling in all of their hearts right now, and that's who I'm thinking of sitting here.
Well, and you know, I have to say, probably there are Canadians across the country right now, if not every Canadian, that's feeling that sense of pride right now, as well as David Saint-Jacques is now on his way to his ISS. Nicole, as you're watching that, of course, there was some concern because in October, there was a Soyuz launch that was aborted 2 minutes into its launch. Happily did not happen today. We watched it successfully take off and make it past the orbit. What are your thoughts right now?
Well, right now, I'm obviously thrilled that David is safe and up there and fulfilling that dream, and that all that hard work that he's been undergoing for the past 9 years. He's been training intensively for this. That's paid off. But the other thing is, you know, Chris kind of touched on this too, a sense of pride. Being Canadian, we don't get a lot of astronauts up there, but I was talking with Jeremy Hansen, and he said this is really important.
Who's the next Canadian?
Is the next Canadian astronaut after David. He's been training with David, and he said, you know, he looks at this launch and Canadians going up there as something positive that is inspirational for other Canadians. He said when he saw it, when the astronaut program started when he was young, it inspired him. So we're inspiring a next generation of Canadians.
Mm-hmm, absolutely. We actually heard that from Jenny Seide, as who is going to actually be going up as well, that she would be very inspired by this and ensure that there are children watching this also inspired. Chris, I want you to perhaps quickly describe for us the launch itself. It seemed to be picture perfect.
Yeah, it goes in three main stages. The first thing that you have to do is get above the air. In order to orbit the world, you have to be going 8 kilometers a second. Otherwise, you won't be going fast enough and you'll tumble down into the atmosphere. So at the first stage, you can't go 8 kilometers a second down here in the air. It would slow you down. So the first stage, the first 2 minutes, was to get them above the air. And then those rockets did their job. They were out of fuel and they exploded off. So that was the first big threshold, a really good moment for the crew, the one that failed on the last launch. The second stage, the main one, is just getting them above the last vestiges of the atmosphere and getting them out to a really high speed. And then that rocket fell away. You can feel it. You're like being crushed for a long, long time. And then boom, that rocket lets go. It's as if you were sitting on a bus and someone suddenly pushed you way forward and then pushed you way back in your chair again. And then the third stage kicked in to do all the fine tuning and get them up to the perfect speed that'll hold them in orbit. And all of those things happened. You know, there were the tower jettisoned off and the big aerodynamic shield jettisoned off. But every one of those systems worked perfectly today. And when the spaceship got to orbit, when the little Soyuz, like an egg in this incredibly complicated carton, was delivered to space, it came to life perfectly. The arrays, everything deployed, the antennas, so that it could now start searching for the space station and start its rendezvous. Everything seems to be working perfectly. So an immensely complicated bunch of dominoes in a row, a very risky one, but David and his crew are there.
Mm-hmm. And I just want to quickly correct myself. Jenny Seide Gibbons was the one who had noted that during the press conference of the Canadian Space Agency. And we want to remind Canadians who are watching us right now, no matter how you're watching us, whether you're on the go or at home, you can ask your questions of both Chris and Nicole about the mission ahead as well as the launch. And to that, I want to bring in, Chris, a question for you. This is from John Winchester, who has a question about the iPads or the tablets that astronauts and cosmonauts seems to be using. He says, can Chris tell us what the tablets are for?
So when I flew on my 3 space flights, we had a combination, depending on how advanced the technology was, of electronic checklists and paper checklists. The beauty of a paper checklist is, of course, you never have to reboot it and the battery doesn't wear down. The disadvantage is it's hard to turn pages, especially if your suit is pressurized, and you have to have multiple books. There are a dozen books there in the cockpit if you have to have all of your different emergency books right there in front of you. So they've put all those, that the technology is rugged enough and reliable enough now that they can have the checklist on one of the flat screen kind of pads. I'm not sure which one they're using, but It's provided, it's tested, it's what they've been using in the simulator, and it has the procedures if everything goes right, but it also, they can flick through and get to the procedures no matter if they had an engine failure or a leak or all the other things that could go wrong, where they can immediately get to the right set of actions and be reminded of what switches and what controls they need to take care of in order to safely pilot the vehicle. So it's just kind of the modern checklist, and it's nice to see it integrated into this version of the Soyuz.
You know, Nicole, you were mentioning the fact that this launch and seeing a Canadian successfully make it to space will inspire children across the country. And in fact, to that, we want to fast track this question. This is Jace, and Jace, who is 10 years old, thank you for sending your questions via Facebook. And this is what Jace is asking Chris, and also Nicole, you can pick up after Chris. How does the spaceship travel back to Earth now that the engines have fallen off? Chris?
The Soyuz, of course, the big boosters that pushed the Soyuz to space, once they'd done their job, if it was a big person behind you getting you going really fast, it just falls back to Earth. So those rockets tumbled back down to the empty prairies of Kazakhstan. The little tiny Soyuz is now in orbit, and it has its own little fuel tanks and its own little engine, just big enough to steer it and propel it up to dock with the space station. And then 6 months or so from now, David and his crew will get back into that same Soyuz, undock from the space station, back away, turn around backwards, and fire that engine just long enough to turn their orbit from a perfect circle to sort of like an oval. And the low part of that oval will be able to touch the atmosphere, and that'll slow them down, so that then they can sort of fly like a meteorite down through the atmosphere until they get down low enough where they can deploy a parachute and land. So they're really little now, but therefore their engine can be little, and that's how the vehicle's designed to bring them back home whenever, maybe July, I think, is the date that they're planning when they come back.
You know, Nicole, I'm going to get you to jump in because, you know, Chris, before you joined our conversation, Nicole and I were talking a bit about the Soyuz technology, as really it dates back to the 60s here. And there is a generation of Canadians who have watched space travel only on the shuttle. And of course, the shuttle took off from Earth using the booster rockets, but then landed as a shuttle back on Earth. The capsule seems a bit more nerve-wracking. You know, that's actually what I wanted to ask Chris about too, because you know, back at the start of the space program, we had astronauts splashing down into the ocean, and then we had the shuttle, which seemed wonderful. It's a glider and it comes down, and now that we're traveling on the Soyuz, you know, this landing on Earth. Chris, how jarring is that?
Well, the landing is abrupt. It's kind of a rude welcome home, for sure, because you're a multi-ton vehicle, you know, like a big, heavy SUV or something, and you're just being carried by one big parachute, and it slows you down enough to make it safe. But we actually put little gunpowder rockets on the bottom of that vehicle so that when you're just 1.5 meters or so above the ground, they can fire and slow you down that last little bit so you don't hit the ground too hard. But you've still got the wind to deal with. So even if you're coming down slowly, you're still going to hit the ground and tumble end over end, as our spaceship did. So it's like, take that, Earth, I'm back. And especially after 6 months of weightlessness, it's quite hard to deal with. But it's also simple and rugged and tough. The space shuttle was the most capable flying machine ever built. But it was also very dangerous. We had 2 accidents that killed both crews and demolished each of those shuttles with Challenger and Columbia, friends of mine on board in Columbia. And the Soyuz may be smaller and less capable, but it's also far, far tougher and simpler. And so there's always that trade-off. And I'm lucky and happy to have flown both. But the one that is far more reliable, no matter what fails, is the Soyuz. It's a real natural design for spaceships. And that's why pretty much all of the new spaceships, they look a lot more like a Soyuz than they do like a space shuttle.
Does your body feel that? Weeks, days, months afterwards, considering that you are, as you say, in an SUV hurtling back to Earth?
You're pretty well cushioned. You're actually in a crash seat, a custom poured and carved crash seat for exactly the same reason that Formula One drivers are, so that if you have a violent crash, your body is protected enough that you won't break your back or break your neck. The seat is even raised on a hydraulic jack, so that when you hit the ground, that jack soaks up some of the rapid deceleration to protect you. So I didn't really have any lingering effects from the impact with the ground. It's more the physiological readaptation, your balance system and your blood pressure regulation system, and just trying to get your bone density back to where it was. Those are the things that are the big difference when you come home. The vehicle itself, it's a little bit rugged, but it's you know, you are an egg, and it's the container, and it is sacrificing the container so that the egg could crawl out of the ship and still be okay. And the Soyuz has a great track record for that.
Okay, and as we say, inspiring kids, we're going to fast track another question here. Chris, this is from Sarah Slaney. She's 9 years old, and on Facebook, she's asking this question. What does it feel like when you're taking off? Can you move?
Good morning, Sarah. You are strapped in hard into a seat. If you get into an airplane, Sarah, and the flight attendants tell you to do up your seatbelt, and you get your seatbelt nice and tight, and you're sort of stuck in your chair. Imagine if you had 5 seatbelts, or in fact 7 seatbelts, where you've got one around your waist, one over each shoulder, one up between your legs, and then one on each knee, just to hold your knees in the right place. That's sort of how you're squished in the chair in the Soyuz, because if something violent happens, you don't want your body flying around. And so you can move your arms, you can move your head, but your body is pretty much pinned. And I don't know if you saw, but David and Oleg Kononenko, the commander, they actually have like an extendable stick that they're holding, because their bodies are so pinned, they can't reach everything in the cockpit. So they have this little udlanitil, this extender stick, so they can poke all the buttons in the cockpit. And it's really just because of what you said in your question, and that is that your body is firmly part of the ship, and it's only your eyes and your head and your arms and your hands that are free to move around and operate everything.
Okay, Chris, we only have about a minute here, but I do want to ask, because we've had 2 Canadian kids ask you questions now, how tough is it actually to become an astronaut?
It's almost impossible to become an astronaut. There have been very few of us, but it's also almost impossibly hard to do what David just did, and to be ready for it, to learn to speak Russian and fly a spaceship in Russian. That's a huge demand. And I think it's great. I mean, if it was easy to win an Olympic gold medal, then it wouldn't be special, and it wouldn't inspire people to change who they were, to try and do something that's really exquisitely hard. So it's never guaranteed. But at the same time, it is possible, as David just demonstrated for everybody, and as Jenny's getting ready for. So I think some things, they ought to be hard, because then they're really worth doing.
Reach for the stars, in other words, right, Chris?
Yeah.
Okay, listen, Chris and Nicole, stay where you are. But again, to anyone at home, or even if you're on the go, if you have any questions about today's Soyuz launch or what it's like to travel to or live on the International Space Station, we do, of course, have your answers. Thanks to Chris Hadfield, our very special guest today, as well as Nicole Motolato, our science and technology writer. We're going to continue your questions. Those of you that are listening to us on social media, do stay with us. We're going to continue this. But those who are watching us on CBC News Network, we're going to take a quick break here, but stay with us. Much more of your questions coming up. Again, tweet us, email us, send us questions through YouTube or Facebook. We have you covered today. Chris Hadfield, Nicole Motolato, we'll have more. And I'm Michael Saravio, sitting in for Heather Hiscox. Stay with us.
Engines have started and are now at the preliminary thrust level, throttling up. And liftoff. We have liftoff of Anne McLean, David Saint-Jacques, and Oleg Kononenko blasting through the Kazakh sky to the International Space Station. Everything looking good so far. Good first stage performance. Soyuz delivering 930,000 pounds of thrust.
Copy. Everything is fine on board.
And we continue our coverage right now on social media and as well as online. Nicole Motolato is here, as well as Chris Hadfield. I'm going to ask the same question of both of you because we're getting this one via YouTube. And Sam is asking, what is the mission for this space trip? Nicole, I'll get you to begin that answer, and Chris, I'll ask you to pick up afterwards.
Well, David has, these astronauts have, as Chris can speak to, various chores and experiments. And for David, he's actually going up and doing several experiments. He's really interested and invested in doing telemedicine, so remote medicine. He was a physician in a remote community himself, so he recognizes the importance of this technology that is tested and used up at the space station that will be continued on and can actually be carried on here on Earth.
Mm-hmm. And Chris, very quickly, do you want to add to that?
The space station is incredibly complicated, and it's going around the world every 92 minutes. So it's not like David just has one mission. He's helping to run, as Nicole just said, some of the 200 experiments on board, but he's also making the ship work. And if they have a problem on the outside of the ship, David might be asked to go outside and do spacewalks.
Very quickly,
to operate
Chris.
our Canadarm. So there's a whole suite of experiments on board.
Okay, thank you. Let's hold it right here. Well, just some of the reaction to something we all witnessed just about almost an hour ago now, 50 minutes ago, the successful launch of the Soyuz rocket into space. A historic moment for Canadian space travel, David Saint-Jacques becoming the first Canadian since 2013 to travel to space. He and two other astronauts, one from Russia, the other from the United States, now all on their way to the International Space Station. Well, Jayla Bernstein is at the Canadian Space Agency. That's in Saint-Hubert, Quebec. She is joined by former astronaut Bob Thirsk. Hello, Jayla.
Good morning, Michael. So we've all been watching this together. We watched the launch together here with Bob Thirsk. And the last time that Bob Thirsk was in space that he went through what we just saw on that screen was, I believe, 2009, right?
Yes, that's correct.
So what was it like for you to watch David Saint-Jacques go through what you've been through before?
Well, you're probably going to laugh when I say this, but I was more nervous today than I was on launch day. On launch day, you know, when you're inside the capsule, you're focused on the role that you have to play. Today, I was just hoping that capsule was going to get up to space safely, so I was just a little bit nervous today, but I was relieved, of course, when everything turned out well.
Yeah, I can imagine when it's someone you know that you care about, you're nervous, where when you're in the moment, you're all on the adrenaline, you're so focused on your mission.
Yeah, there's a job to do when you're actually there inside the capsule, when you're at a distance, and like you say, when you've got a good friend, a kindred spirit that's flying in space, you certainly get wrapped up in the emotional aspect of flight.
So what would you imagine he's going through right now? What is he thinking about? What is he doing with the other crew members?
So David, since childhood, has had this dream about flying in space. And he's worked so hard for so many years before becoming an astronaut, after becoming an astronaut, in the pursuit of this dream. And today, his dream came fulfilled. He's looked out the window. He has a window about this size, just at his left shoulder. He's looking down. He's seeing the curvature of the Earth. He's seeing inky black behind there. And he's got this adrenaline rush over him right now. So he's realizing the dream has come true, and he's about to head off on an incredible adventure.
And although he's about to head off on this adventure, I mean, he's not just relaxing in the spacecraft right now, he's busy.
Yes, one of the differences between his flight today and my flight in 2009 is that he's going to be rendezvousing, docking with the station in only 4 orbits, or 6 hours. For my crew, we took 2 days to do that. So he's going to be very busy, moving quickly. He's got 2 engine firings that they have to do in the next 45 minutes or so to raise their orbit to catch up to the space station. So they're going to be very, very busy over the next 6 hours.
The launch day, obviously the launch is very important, and as he was saying earlier in the video, we saw kind of one of the most, well, it's the moment that they prepare for the most in the mission is the launch because it's so difficult. But what about the arrival at the International Space Station? What is that moment like when you actually climb on board?
You're absolutely right. The training of an astronaut is focused on bad days in space, or the most complex, most difficult tasks. But in reality, most of the missions unfold perfectly. When they are docked to the station today, they'll take about 2 hours before they open up the hatch and float through. but when he floats through, he'll float through like Superman. He'll have this big goofy grin on his face. The 3 crew members who will already be aboard of the spaceship will come up and give him a hug and really make him feel welcome and again, kick off this new adventure that he's starting.
So it's really kind of a celebratory atmosphere.
Today is a lot of hard work, but as soon as the hatch is open, it will be total celebration.
And I think you were saying that when you get to the International Space Station, it's not exactly like what the models for practicing look like. It's a little bit different.
I felt when I first entered the International Space Station 9 years ago that I was walking inside of a Salvador Dali painting. Everything was surreal. The walls, instead of being clean walls like in the simulators, the trainers on the ground, they had stowage all over the place and cameras and laptops all over the place and crisscrosses of cables and hoses all over the place. And I sort of arrived and I thought, uh-oh, what have I got myself into here? But it all makes sense. And over the next couple of days, his crewmates will explain to him why those computers are there, why those hoses are there, and it'll make total sense to him.
So a little surreal at first, but you get used to it over time. It becomes normal, I guess. He's going to be there for 6.5 months.
After, I'd say, 10 days in space, David will feel like he was born in space, which means like he'll look at his legs and say, why do I have legs? I don't really need them anymore, because he's just flying around like Spider-Man or Superman. He'll really adapt quickly to spaceflight. The brain is a wonderfully adaptive organ.
So this is obviously, today is a big deal for Canadians, for the Canadian Space Agency to have one of our own heading to the International Space Station. Can you tell people on the ground here who aren't as familiar with space travel why today is so important for the program itself, for the future of the program in Canada?
When I was young, I was fascinated with the stories of early Canadian explorers, so the Indigenous people, the Vikings, La Vérendrye, Sir Alexander Mackenzie. I developed that spirit of exploration when I was young, and many other young Canadians did as well. And then we had a president in the United States back then who said that we choose to go to space because it's hard, not because it's easy. So what David did today was exploration. What David did today was hard. And we need to tell Canadians that, for fulfilled life, to really get out of our comfort zone, to really make a difference on the international stage, we need to do things that are hard. We need to take on near impossible challenges. The space program provides us with that. So I'm a strong believer in investing in the space program.
And what a perfect note to end on, that note of inspiration. Back to you, Michael.
Jayla, thank you. And thank you to Bob Thirsk as well, both of you joining us at the Canadian Space Agency. Now, we're going to stay on this story. In fact, if you've been watching us this morning, you know that Chris Hadfield has been with us. He'll be back in just a moment, part of our special coverage today of David Saint-Jacques and his ride to the International Space Station, if you will. It's not often you get an astronaut in the hot seat, let alone one with such an accomplished career. So whether you want to know about the Soyuz launch or just life as an astronaut, you can keep sending us your questions. We're at Morning Live on Twitter. Our email is morninglive@cbc.ca. Keep sending your questions. We're going to ask it throughout the morning. You are watching CBC News Network. We are back in a moment.
Engines have started and are now at the preliminary thrust level, throttling up. And liftoff. We have liftoff of Anne McLean, David Saint-Jacques, and Oleg Kononenko blasting through the Kazakh sky to the International Space Station.
Copy.
Everything looking good so far. Good first stage performance. Soyuz delivering 930,000 pounds of thrust.
Copy. Everything is fine on board.
And we do continue our coverage right now on cbcnews.ca, as well as our social media streams of Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube. Once again, we're bringing in Chris Hadfield, who joins us in Los Angeles, Nicole Motolato, science and technology writer, here in studio with me. So let's continue the questions here. Sam asked this question, and Chris, I think you got to be the one to answer this one. Do they have Tim Hortons in the spaceship? What's the coffee in space like? As a morning show, we're very interested.
As a Canadian on board, the Canadian Space Agency worked with all the other partners, and one of the things they provided was Canadian food. And so we gathered some specialty foods right from coast to coast to coast, some jerky from the north and some really nice chocolate from the west coast, and food like that, some honey from the east coast. But they also had coffee on board. It's in bags. It's dehydrated. It's not the best coffee ever, but we had Tim Hortons coffee on board. And in fact, the Russians knew that that was the best coffee on board. And Roman Romanenko, who was the cosmonaut that I flew with, he actually called everything else, his word for like second best was deputy. So he would call everything else deputy coffee, deputy coffee. Мне нравится Tim Hortons, пожалуйста. So Roman would come down specifically to go through our coffee larder to pick out Tim Hortons and drink it on orbit. It was a nice little touch of Canada away from home.
I can imagine. Now, if they can only have steep tea. Very quickly, though. Nicole, I don't know if you could answer this one. Another question being asked, and this is from Peter on Twitter. How many astronauts in training are there in Canada? Do we know that?
Yeah, well, right now, of course, you have Josh and Jenny, the 2 new recruits, and Jeremy, and now David's up there, so 3. We actually have 3.
So 3 ready on the go, and I guess it is months and months, years and years of training, right, Chris?
Yeah, and it's, we call it training, but in fact, you invent spaceflight. It's still that new. So many of the things I did in my 21 years in the astronaut office had never been done before. So how do you train for something when there's nobody really to teach
Chris.
you?
Stay with us.
Engines have started and are now at the preliminary thrust level, throttling up.
Engines at maximum thrust, liftoff.
And liftoff. We have liftoff of Anne McLean, David Saint-Jacques, and Oleg Kononenko blasting through the Kazakh sky to the International Space Station.
Copy.
And that was the moment about an hour ago, the Soyuz rocket taking off, and on board Canadian David Saint-Jacques, now in orbit on his way to the International Space Station. In fact, as we say, now in orbit, he's in fact orbiting the Earth, and he's not alone. He's there with a Russian cosmonaut as well as an American astronaut. And the Russian Space Agency says this morning's liftoff was trouble-free. This is the first Soyuz launch since October, when a problem with a rocket stage triggered an abort and a high-altitude escape for the crew. Well, we keep tracking David Saint-Jacques' journey today and everything that has led up to it. Once again, joining us, Chris Hadfield, Canadian astronaut, who joins us this morning from Los Angeles. And in studio, Nicole Mortolaro, the science and technology writer for CBC News. So let's pick up our conversation. And Chris, I'm going to apologize to you because people on News Network may not know this, but we've been continuing our conversations in the commercial breaks with those who have joined us on social media, as well as cbcnews.ca. And we were talking a bit about the amount of training an astronaut like David Saint-Jacques has had to undergo in order to get to this point. Talk to us more about what he's done to prepare for this moment.
Yeah, once you're on board the International Space Station, or the Soyuz, where David and Oleg and Anne are right now, there's nobody that can really help you. There are people that you can talk to on the radio, sort of like on the phone, can give you some advice. But what that means is you have to kind of know everything about everything. And often, one of the main things that'll fail when you have an emergency is your ability to communicate back with Earth. So if you thought for the next 6 months, which is what David has left Earth for, everything that could possibly go wrong in 6 months, you now have to know how to fix. You have to have all of those skill sets, whether it's reprogramming the computers or doing surgery on somebody or operating Canadarm, responding to a leak outside where you have to go out on a spacewalk, or any of the 200 experiments failing. All of those things you not only have to be familiar with, but you have to be expert on. And so it takes a tremendous amount of preparation and also short-term and long-term memory to be able to put all those things into your skill set, into your head, so that you can be trusted to do everything. And that's why the selection is difficult. That's why the training's been so long. And there's nobody readier in the universe than those 3 people in the Soyuz right now, including David.
Mm-hmm. I want to bring in a question here. This is from Aaron Blair, who's in Maxville, Ontario. And this is the question that Aaron is asking. There are no shortage of pressures, concerns between Russia and the rest of the world. Are all the geopolitical concerns put aside for endeavors like this one? How do global politics, do they actually get involved when countries come together for a mission like this, Chris?
Aaron, imagine if in the next hour you could go around the world once, or hour and a half. And you could go around the world 16 times a day, 16 times today. Imagine that. You would see the world differently by bedtime if you'd been around it 16 times. And there are a lot of rivalries and shortages and competition for resources and things around the world. But it is a very different perspective to be able to go around it in the time it takes to eat dinner and dessert. And so that, I think, shifts your focus away from some of the transient animosities and the things that we find super important down here on the surface. You inevitably see the world as one place. If you can go around it in an hour and a half, it's not that big. And so, yeah, there's always political tensions. I mean, there are political tensions between different boroughs of Toronto or one town to the next town. But I think it does us a lot of good to step back and put those into their true perspective. How much is that just local noise, and how much is really part of what we should be doing together as a species on the planet? And it's not the main purpose of spaceflight, but I think the way that we can see ourselves and the way we can not focus on the minutiae of the noise of the day, I think that's something that David will internalize, but he's going to do his best to share with you and everybody else in Canada and around the planet over the next 6 months.
Okay, Chris, thank you. We'll hold it there for now, but again, reminding everyone across the country that you can send your questions about what lies ahead for David Saint-Jacques, Canadian astronaut now on his way to the International Space Station. Chris Hadfield is staying with us, as well as Nicole Motilado. Do stay with us. You're watching CBC News Network. You can see there the addresses where you can send your questions. To those on News Network, we're back in a moment. To those watching us online or on social media, stay with us. The conversation continues in a matter of seconds. Okay, and we are back online as well as on social media. And about 2 minutes here to both Chris and Nicole. Nicole, you just want to pick up on where Chris left off about the geopolitical concerns?
Well, yeah, I just wanted to say, it's, when you think about the International Space Station, it was a partnership between the U.S. and the Soviet Union at a time when you might not think that that was going to happen. So I think just the creation of the International Space Station illustrates how we can put apart these geopolitical concerns.
Okay. Chris, again, we're now just under 2 minutes here before we come back on News Network, but this is from Joy Kelly. What is the difference between microgravity and regular gravity? Will there be follow-up tests done to look at vision issues experienced after lengthy stays in space?
Yeah, we call it microgravity. What we really, you're weightless, essentially. Micro means it's just, millions of a fraction of gravity. Essentially, you can't feel gravity at all. You get a tiny pull from the moon, tiny pull from the sun, tiny pull from the earth, but you're basically Superman up there. But that has a toll on the body, how your blood moves around, whether you're going to have dense bones or not, what happens to your muscles, what happens to your balance system. And in some people's cases, the change of fluid changes the shape of their eyeball and vision. And we're studying all those things. There's Canadian universities and businesses that are on board with David just to try and learn from all that, to understand the human body better, not just for astronauts, but for all people with all of those different issues, and in a lot of cases, aging Canadians. What's going to happen to David's body over the next 6 months? It's kind of like super accelerated aging. So he ends up being a lab rat to do all that high-speed testing to see how the body actually performs. How does it actually work? And so we're there will be no drop of fluid or invasive experimentation that he won't be willing to do in order to try and help answer all those questions.
Okay, thank you for that, Chris. Stay with us. Keep sending your questions. We're now going to rejoin CBC News Network. Stand by. And welcome back. We've been tracking David Saint-Jacques' journey into space and discussing what it will be like with our own panel of experts. Chris Hadfield made that very journey from the launch pad in Kazakhstan to the International Space Station, where he became the first Canadian to command a spaceship in 2013. Also an author, professor, test pilot. He joins us in Los Angeles. And in studio, Nicole Mortellaro covers science and technology for us here at CBC News. You know, as we keep talking about today's launch, and we had that successful launch. We saw it here live an hour ago. Nicole, I'm going to begin here with you, because as we talk about this launch, I also want to talk about David Saint-Jacques. For those Canadians who may be familiar with the name but not the man, tell us about him and more of his biographical sketch, if you will.
So David is a physician. He has a degree, a PhD in astrophysics. He's an engineer. He's very hardworking. He's an avid mountaineer, a skier, a scuba diver. You know, it's all these things add up to, you know, a perfect career choice here as an astronaut, adventurer. But he was actually very focused with working with remote communities in medicine in remote communities. He was in Nunavik. Before joining the astronaut corps, a remote community off the near Hudson's Bay. And this is an accomplished man, and very caring and really concerned about people down here on Earth. You know, oftentimes you hear people say, why do we send astronauts up there? Well, what he's doing up there will be working on medicine, remote medicine, that can be applied here on Earth.
Mm-hmm. So obviously important information that he's going to gather as he carries out those experiments. And Chris, we get an idea from a bit of the description of his work. He's going to be very busy for the next 6.5 months.
Yeah, the schedule is relentless. There's a mission control that everybody knows about in Houston, you know, when the astronauts call down and say Houston Space Station. But there's also mission control in Saint-Hubert, Quebec. There's mission control in Moscow, there's one in Munich, and there's one just outside of Tokyo in a town of Tsukuba. And all of those mission controls think they own David. And they're all going to be telling him what to do for the next 6 months. And it's a big discussion every single day of how his time is going to be prioritized and who's going to get him to do everything. And so every 5 minutes is dictated for him for the next 6 months. What he's doing now, what he's doing 5 minutes from now, 24 hours a day for over 6 months. And that's just so that we don't waste the opportunity. We want to take advantage of every single second. It's an expensive thing for Canada to be part of. We don't want to fritter it away or squander it. And so David will be working at full speed for the next 6 months, trying to be responsive to all of those different the demands from around the world, trying to wring every last second out of his spaceflight experience on behalf of everybody on Earth.
Well, so busy is almost an understatement as to what he's going to be facing over the next few months. But that does lead me, Chris, to a question. This is from Luc Leblanc, who asked by email to us, is there any chance that one of the astronauts on board could get very sick? And if so, how do they deal with that? If you're working all the time, you know, here on Earth, that can wear your immune system down. How about up in space? What happens? Can you get sick? How do you deal with that?
Well, initially, Luc, to answer your question, David and the crew have been in quarantine for the last 2 weeks, and that's so they don't bring a cold up to the space station. They haven't been able to visit with anybody. Nobody's been able to get close to them who might have a cold, anything contagious. In fact, over the last 12 hours, David had his entire body wiped down with rubbing alcohol, and that's just to make sure that there's nothing on your skin, no sort of problem where you're bringing up some fungal spores or anything up to the spaceship. All of those just to make the environment on board the space station as perfectly healthy as possible. But of course, he might get injured up there. That could happen. You could catch your finger in something, or you know, it's not what we want to have happen, but there could be a fire or something on board. So we have to train crew members to be at least an emergency medical technician. David's already a doctor, of course, but his other crew members will be trained so that they can take care of each other. And if something serious happens, we have a small sort of pharmacy on board, all of the emergency equipment, breathing equipment. You have one of those heart restarting machines and everything that they might need in a hurry. And that part of the training is really important because it may mean the difference between life or death for someone on board. So yeah, we think about it, we prepare for it, we have the equipment on board, and hopefully it'll never happen.
Absolutely. Chris, thank you again. Stay with us. Much more to come. And another reminder for you who are watching us right now, no matter how you're doing it, whether you're at home watching on TV or online, you can ask your questions today of Chris Hadfield as well as Nicole Motolato, our science and technology writer. Ask any question about David Saint-Jacques, his mission, as well as the Soyuz launch that we saw live here on CBC News Network. Morning Live at cbc.ca is the email address. At CBC Morning Live is the Twitter address. Stay with us. And those who are watching online and the social media streams, I'm glad you stayed with us because you didn't have to wait very long. We continue the conversation. You know, Chris, you're talking about preparing for any eventuality. John Hamilton on Facebook is asking, Alexander Bruskin is asking, what happens if you leave the screwdriver at home? And I don't think he means vodka and orange juice.
Get on board. It's in the central node in one of the drawers, and we have a pretty good toolkit. We can fix things. We can do basic repair of almost anything on board. And we have a lot of spare parts as well because you're so far from home. It's as if you were in a ship at sea that has been at sea for 20 years and has never been able to pull into port. And in fact, it was built while it was at sea. So you have to have all of your tools there with you. And we have a full tool set inside. And then, of course, we have tools outside. If you're outside on a spacewalk, you can go around to the big toolboxes and open them up and get out the tools that you need. And they're permanently up there. We only bring up and down with us, screwdriver, whatever. We only bring up and down the absolute minimum on each flight. You only want to bring the critical resupply equipment. Anything you're going to need on a recurring basis, hopefully it's been put up there years ago, decades ago.
Mm-hmm. Another question here. This is from Kira McClellan, who says, how long did it take you to get comfortable in the ISS? Once you dock, do you have time to set up your sleeping dock and get situated before starting your work?
Kara, thanks. Yeah, I flew in space 3 times. I was on the Russian space station Mir and then the International Space Station twice. The crew up there works so hard to get things ready for you. Company's coming. And so the 3 of them up there, Alex Gerst, German, is the current commander. For the last week or so, they will have been getting everybody's little nest ready. Making sure the crew quarters are fully cleaned out, all the filters are cleaned, and then retrieving David and Anne and Oleg's equipment, all their clothes, setting the computers up,
quickly,
so
Chris.
that when they dock and they float in, the ship will already be ready. Their bedrooms will be ready for them.
Okay, Chris, thank you. Thank you for being patient with me as well. Stay with us. We're going to rejoin CBC News Network in just a few seconds. Those online and on social media, we are coming back. Stay with us. Well, welcome back. We are examining every angle of the David Saint-Jacques journey into space, from his training to what he can expect while he is there, with our 2 experts. Chris Hadfield, of course, Canadian astronaut, well known to Canadians across our country, joins us today from Los Angeles. And here in studio, Nicole Motolato, who is our science and technology writer at CBC News. Nicole, I'll begin with you because I asked a bit with Chris earlier on, and he was understandably humble. But how hard is it to become an astronaut? Because people like Chris and David Saint-Jacques beat out thousands of people to have this honor.
Well, it's very difficult, obviously. Let's remember, too, you look at our astronaut corps, it's very small. We get 2 at a time, and it takes us years to fly. They look at things, obviously your health, your what you do, your education. So it's a challenge for anybody. I mean, I don't think anybody should cross it off the list if that's what they're looking to do. It's still on my list, but it is difficult, and you have to keep that into consideration. Now, I'm hoping, that with with the movement to space seems to be really picking up. So perhaps we are going to see maybe a recruitment of like in the 80s and 90s of maybe 5 at a time, and maybe we'll see more missions because we're talking about going now to the moon and Mars. So maybe we'll need more people to do that.
Mm-hmm. Well, Chris, what do you say to that?
Well, when the ships get better and simpler, then you don't need to have relying on the skill of the crew to make them work nearly as much. I mean, if you look when the very first airplane flew in 1909 in Canada, it took every bit of skill that J.A. McCurdy had just to be able to make the Silver Dart fly at all. And other people may have wanted to fly, but they all would have crashed. You needed that learned skill to be able to do it. But now, of course, it's almost ridiculously easy to fly in Canada. If you can just afford to buy the cheapest of tickets, you can fly across the country with virtually no skills at all. But that's because the technology got better. The airplanes are simpler and more reliable. There's room for people who aren't just actively involved in flying it, who can actually fly along as an air traveler. And so the opportunity for space travel is coming also. But we're still early days. I mean, when I was born, no one had ever flown in space. It's still new. It's still a new thing. But as Nicole said, there's more ships coming down the pike. They are simpler, more automated, more reliable. And with each one of those, it improves the chances for more people to be space travelers. And I'm all for it. I mean, it's a great experience, just like air travel, only magnified. And so the better we can make the equipment and the more people can fly in space, I think the better we'll understand our Earth.
Okay, Chris, we only have a minute left, but I have to squeeze in this question because this is from Madden Stewart, a grade 5 student, and a grade 5 student, get this, Chris Hadfield Public Elementary School, that is in Milton, Ontario. So, Chris, here is the question from a student at a school of your namesake. What are the nerves like when you first walk into the spaceship? Is it a calm nervousness? Are you freaking out? Please describe that feeling and what's going through your head.
Hi to everybody at Chris Hadfield Public School. You're not nervous, you're ready. You would be nervous if you didn't know what to do, but you have been getting it's like an exam where you know the answer to every question. And all you really want to do is start writing down your answers. And all you're really worried about is that they're not going to let you go today, because you are supremely ready as a human can be. You've gotten rid of your nerves years previous. You are the readiest and most capable you could possibly be. So that's how you feel walking out to the ship. You feel like bigger than yourself. You feel like this is a day that I can handle and bring it on. I want to do this thing today.
Oh, what a great feeling. Madden, hopefully that answered your question. Chris, thank you. Stay with us. Nicole, stay with us. Those watching on CBC News Network, a quick break and we return. Those watching online and on our social media channels, stay with us. We're back in just a couple of seconds.
Started and are now at the preliminary thrust level, throttling up. And liftoff. We have liftoff of Anne McLean, David Saint-Jacques, and Oleg Kononenko blasting through the Kazakh sky to the International Space Station.
Copy.
Everything looking good so far. Good first stage performance. Soyuz delivering 930.
And welcome back to those watching on CBCNews.ca as well as CBC News social media channels. We have only about a minute and a half here. And Chris, I've been dying to ask you this question because Shelley Morgan asked this question on Facebook almost an hour ago. I wonder if astronauts like roller coasters. Is this a natural extension of this passion?
Yeah, I like roller coasters, but, Shelley, I prefer roller coasters that I can drive. I don't mind riding in a roller coaster, but to me it's much more interesting if you could take the roller coaster somewhere that it's never been before. Imagine if you could get on a roller coaster and go and explore some place that only the roller coaster could take you, not just be a passive blivet bouncing around in it, but actually use that machine to go do something brand new. To me, that's the best thing. I don't mind roller coasters, but I really like being able to use machinery to push the very edge of what we can do collectively together.
Okay, so I guess if you ever go to Canada's Wonderland or to the PNE, you have to tell people, let me drive, I'm an astronaut. Okay, listen, Chris, Nicole, stay with us. We're about to rejoin CBC News Network. Here we go. And welcome back. Now, all morning we've been focusing on the 9th Canadian to go into space. We're talking about David Saint-Jacques, who successfully launched on a Soyuz, with him an American and a American astronaut, Russian cosmonaut. Let's continue our conversation now with Chris Hadfield, as well as Nicole Moltolato, our science and technology reporter here at CBC. So listen, we only have about 3 minutes left before we get to the top of the clock. So I want to go to each of you. Your final impressions. We saw that launch live on air here on CBC News Network. What are your final impressions as our thoughts now move to David Saint-Jacques and what lies ahead for him?
Well, obviously thrilled and really looking forward to his work on the International Space Station, and of course him sharing the experience with people, with Canadians around and people around the world, much as of course Chris did and became very well known for. Although David says he's not going to try to outdo Chris. That's all up to Chris. That's Chris's forte.
Yeah, I think Chris, he left for you the singing legacy. He's
yes.
not promising to sing.
Yes, but it will be interesting to see it because every experience is a new one.
Mm-hmm. Chris, what were your impressions right now as your thoughts drift on to David Saint-Jacques?
I think everybody in Canada should notice what an incredible person he is and be proud of it. He has studied and worked and contributed his entire life. Working as an astrophysicist and then working as a doctor in remote locations, taking care of Canadians in our north. And then for the last 9 years in service to our country as an astronaut, willing to risk his life today to be that Canadian trusted to go out right to the very edge of the human experience and try and understand it as well as we can and bring all that information back for everybody. It's still a brand new crazy edge of the envelope activity, and there's one of us, someone who's been working right around the country for his whole life, now right out on the very pointy end of the spear, going to be working there for the next 6 months and trying to share it with everyone. I'm immensely proud of him. I'm happy he got safely to space today. Looking forward to his docking here shortly, but I'm really looking forward to what he's going to share with everybody over the next half year. Mm-hmm.
Well, certainly we are looking forward to that, and our thanks to both you, Chris Hadfield in Los Angeles. Thank you for getting up so early today to be part of our special coverage. Nicole Moltolato, thank you, although you're going to be with us throughout the morning here on CBC News Network. And we also want to tell people that Chris was mentioning the docking with the International Space Station. We're going to keep tracking this whole mission for you, and certainly throughout the day here on CBC News Network, as well as on our online at cbcnews.ca. I'm Michael Serapio. Do stay with us. Much more to come right here on CBC News Network. Your headlines are next, and one more look at the blastoff.
Engines have started and are now at the preliminary thrust level, throttling up.
Engines at maximum thrust, liftoff.
And liftoff. We have liftoff of Anne McLean, David Saint-Jacques, and Oleg Kononenko blasting through the Kazakh sky to the International Space Station.
Copy.
Good first stage performance. Soyuz delivering 930,000 pounds of thrust.
Copy. Everything is fine on board. 30 seconds into flight. All parameters are nominal.
30 seconds in, everything's still looking good. First stage will burn for 2 minutes. First 2 minutes and 6 seconds of the flight.
Flight vehicle stabilization is steady.
Delivering 930,000 pounds of thrust.
Copy. Everything is fine on board. 30 seconds into flight. All parameters are nominal.
30 seconds in, everything's still looking good. First stage will burn for 2 minutes. First 2 minutes and 6 seconds of the flight.
Flight vehicle stabilization is steady. Copy. 50 seconds. Chamber pressure is nominal. 60 seconds.
Everything looking good. Vehicle is stable. Good first stage performance. The vehicle now traveling over 1,100 miles per hour.
Seconds into flight. Everything is nominal. 80 seconds, all parameters are nominal. Copy. Everything is
1 minute 30 seconds into the flight, everything's still looking good. The stage again will burn for until 1 minute 58 seconds into the flight, and you'll see those 4 strap-on boosters jettison.
100